Hi again. This is episode 2 of DR for Dummies, a series where I show you how to get started using DR in official attempts. This week we're going to discuss the namesake of the whole method, DR, and how to get to it after finishing EO. You'll need to understand how to do EO, so give the previous episode a watch if you don't know what's going on. As always, resources and links will be in the description. I primarily recommend the DR Hitchhiker's Guide, but JavaCuber, aka Jeremy Sheng, has an introduction to DR that you might find helpful. A lot of info also comes from Jay's speed solving forum post, which is slightly dense, but probably useful to solidify your understanding / get some more depth. I myself end up referring to it from time to time, if that's any endorsement. I want to start by mentioning that this is the weakest parts of my attempts personally. To compare, top solvers are largely looking for 9 to 11 move DRs, but I don't find DRs that short typically, and usually end up using 12 to 14 move DRs even off of short EOs. As such, the methods described here are definitely not the best, but they should be enough to eventually get your solutions to the low 30s when you pair it with the HDR techniques I will discuss in the next episode. Anyway, here's the agenda. We're going to start by discussing what DR is and DRM. Then I'll go into the concept of triggers and RZP, and talk about tips, things to keep in mind when getting to DR, and finally how to train and what to do in attempts both at home and officially. With that said, let's dive right into DR. As we did with EO, we need to define what DR is so we know what we're aiming for. DR can be described as a state where all three of the following are true: EO, or edge orientation, CO, corner orientation, and the E-layer edges are in the E-layer. Note that like EO, DR is axis dependent, and we're going to think about completing DR on the UD axis for this tutorial. An equivalent definition is a state that only requires quarter turns on one axis or has EO done on two axes simultaneously. These two are not as useful or clear how to use, so let's just stick to these three requirements for our purposes. Let's go into these in a little more depth. First, EO. We should already have EO done from our previous step, so there isn't anything we need to do differently here. We just need to make sure not to break EO. Corner orientation. Now this is new, and this means that we need the UD stickers to be on the UD faces. Remember that we can pick either axis that doesn't have EO done already to be UD. And finally, we need all the E-layer edges to be in the E-layer. Specifically, the 4 edges that do not have UD stickers, they have to be in the E-layer. So let's take a look at this scramble here. First, EO. Well, we already have EO, and it's pretty quick to check that. These 4 are good. These 4 are also good. These 2 are F and B stickers, but because the other color is UD, we're good there. And same thing is true for these. So EO is all good. Corner orientation. We look at all 8 of the corners, and we ignore the fact that these 2 have different colors. As long as they're U or D, they're good for us. So yeah, so these are all good. And the final thing, E-layer edges in the E-layer. If you look at the E-layer here, you'll notice that none of the E-layer stickers have U or D on them. And because all edges are oriented, because we already checked that, we are good on the E-layer. So this is a domino state. But notice that having domino on one axis doesn't automatically mean that you have DR on another axis. In particular here, there are 2 things that are problematic. One is we don't have corner orientation because this corner does not have red or orange sticking up at the top. In fact, it's actually over here. So because we don't have corner orientation, we automatically aren't in DR. And there actually is one other problem. This edge is a U or D edge, but it's sitting in this E layer here. This is a problem because this means that there is an E layer edge that's sitting in the UD, which is actually over here. We can't solve this without doing a quarter turn on one of the side faces, so this is not in DR. So just be careful about that. Just because you have DR on one side doesn't mean you have DR on the other. Now, a slightly faster way to check for DR is by simply just looking at the U and D layers just directly, actually just even the UD faces. Because we need all E layer edges to be sitting in the E layer, only U and D edges have to be sitting in U or D. And because we know that edges are already oriented, that means that we can't have any U and D stickers sticking out onto the sides here. They all have to be on the U or D faces. And combined with corner orientation, this means that this entire face can only contain white or yellow in this case, or just U and D. That's another quick way that we know that this one doesn't work. And also a quick way to know that edge orientation is not done either. So if you quickly check that these are oriented correctly and that these are also oriented, then instead of having to do all of EO to check, you can just quickly ensure that this is indeed a DR state. You might take a look at this and notice that this is actually very similar to the 3x3x2 cube. This cube is called the Domino cube, and this is where DR gets its name from. The two-phase computer solving algorithm first gets to DR and then solves the rest of the cube from there. This basically halves the number of moves that you need to search in each phase, which makes it exponentially easier to find optimal solutions. This is also true for humans, and this is why we use the method DR for FMC. After you do EO, you generally don't get a DR state, so we need to come up with some way to measure how close we are to DR. Similar to EO, we're going to count the number of pieces that are not in DR, distinguishing the corners from the edges. This is sometimes called DRM, or DR-. Let's take a look at an example. In this one, we have EO already done on F and B. And if we go through the pieces, we just need to count which ones are misoriented and how many of them there are. Let's start with corners. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Remember that this corner is actually oriented, even though it's a yellow sticker on the white face. We don't care the difference between yellow and white, or U and D in this case. So we have 7 corners that are bad. Next, moving to the edges, we see that there are 3 edges that are sitting in the E layer that should not be there, and consequently, there are 3 E layer edges that are not in the E layer. So there are 6 total edges that are bad here. Because EO is preserved after doing a Z rotation, we actually get another DR axis to check. If we flip over to this side, let's count the number of bad corners. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 corners again. And counting edges now, 1, 2, 3, and 4. For this EO then, we have 2 different DRM states. On this axis, we have 7C6E, and on this axis, we have 7C4E, where C and E is pretty obvious. It just denotes how many corners are bad and how many edges are bad. Now, one thing I want to note, because EO was done on F or B, the last move of EO must have either been an F quarter turn or a B quarter turn. But we actually would have gotten a valid EO if we had done a quarter turn in the opposite direction. Does that mean we can get a different DRM for doing the same number of moves? Because we'd replace F with F prime, say? Well, it turns out that the answer is actually no. Switching these moves is actually the same thing as doing F2 or B2, and you can see what these moves do. They perform a 2E2E, swapping the UD edges and the E edges. And so that means that DRM actually won't change for the edges. And just intuitively, if you take a look, the corner orientation doesn't actually change at all by doing a double turn. It turns out that you can only use quarter turns on R, L, F, and B to actually orient corners. This is why in the last video I mentioned that switching the last move of your EO actually doesn't give you a fundamentally different EO, and therefore there's no real reason to write it down. Because the DRM doesn't change, you actually don't get any meaningful change in how close you are to DR, even though the pieces might look that they're different. Let's now try on a different EO for practice this time. Try this on your own first and check your answer. Remember that since EO was done on UD in front and back, we actually have 2 choices for the DR axis, either this one with F and B at the top, or this one with R and L at the top. So yeah, pause the video and see what you end up with. So with F and B at the top, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bad corners, and 1, 2, 3 bad edges in the E layer, which means that this is 5C, 6E. And now with RL at the top, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bad corners, and 2 bad edges in the E layer, which means we have 6C, 4E. And a quick side note, sometimes people will measure edges based on how many of the E layer edges are misplaced, which would have the numbers that I present here for edges being misplaced. I think this is less common than it used to be, but I figure I'd mention it in case you see it in other places or when talking to others about DR. Now that we can recognize DRM, let's try and figure out how to get to DR. This is the key observation. The final move of the DR solution must be a quarter turn on R or L. This means that we can just set everything up to whatever that pattern is, and then do an R or L quarter turn, and we will get DR. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So if we look at what DRM this is, we see that this is 4C, 4E. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2 bad edges in the E layer, which means that there are 2 E layer edges that are not solved. So if we get 4C, 4E, then we just need to set everything up to this exact pattern. It doesn't really matter how we do that. For example, even if it looks something like this, we see that here that like the exact pieces are different, but this is still a DR bar, this is a bar as well, and these two are bad edges that are sitting in the E layer. So if we do a quarter turn, this time on L, we end up with a DR state. So as we just talked about, R is known as a DR trigger, and its associated DRM is 4C4E. While this is the most basic trigger and everything will set up into it, there are two other important triggers that I want to introduce. This one is RU to R prime, or equivalently RU to R. The direction of the final QT doesn't matter for the same reason as for EO. But this is a 3-move trigger that's pretty easy to recognize. You have a bar here and a bar sitting here. And RU to R prime, as you can see, does indeed solve EO. This one is 4C2E. The final basic trigger is this one, which is RU R prime, or RU prime R, RU prime R prime. There's a couple of different variations of this. And this one is 3C2E. You can basically recognize it as almost the same as a sexy move. You have a pair here, and one corner here, which is unoriented. That can be done in this way, or you can have it in this different variation, where you have the pair here, a pair here, and this corner is the one that's misoriented, in which case you can also do it in just 3 moves. The ideas with these two are the same as the idea with R. If we have one of these DRMs, then all we need to do is set up the pieces so that they look in this type of pattern or this type of pattern, whichever one we have for the DRM that we're given. And once we do that, then we're just good to go. We just execute this short little algorithm and we get to DR. Now, there are many, many other triggers also, but I don't mention them here for 2 reasons. One, the other patterns are already hard enough to recognize sometimes, and there's no point in trying to recognize more patterns than you need. 4C4E is more than enough to get started with. And the other thing is the setups are significantly harder. Here's 3 of them that I've listed here. You can see the different associated DRMs. These two, RUL and RL, can be particularly annoying to set up. The pieces need to be set up in a very, very particular way in order to get a nice 3-move finish for DR. This one, on the other hand, 4C6E, has actually saved my back end a couple times, but this one can also be annoying. It's pretty specific in terms of where the pieces need to go in order to solve DR. The only reason I was able to get it to work was because it was already set up in a pretty easy way. So all that to say is you can ignore these, and you can almost always ignore these two as well. Even if you just focus on 4C4E, you're good to go. You'll be good in order to get most of DRs efficiently. Now, sharp viewers may have noticed a problem. In the previous examples that we looked at when we were counting DRM, we didn't actually have any of these triggers. So what do you do in cases like this? This is where humans diverge from computer solvers, as we need an intermediary step, which we call RZP. Supposedly, in Polish, it means completely random moves, and getting to RZP is the same as doing a couple moves, usually 1 to 2 moves, in order to get to a DRM that you recognize, 4C4E, 4C2E, etc. This will make a little bit more sense in the next example we look at. Let's take a peek at an example. So here we already have EO on F and B. If we choose U and D to be the DR axis, notice that we currently have 4C6E, which is not a DRM that we recognize, at least not yet. So what we need to do is we need to do some sequence of moves in order to get to a DRM that we know, and then from there do the remaining setup moves so we can get to DR. The question is, what should that move be? It turns out that if we do an L move and count the number of bad corners, 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 4C, and the number of bad edges is also 4E. So by doing an L move, we have now gotten to 4C4E. As I mentioned before, this step is RZP. So now that we've achieved RZP, we just need to do a couple more moves and we should be good to go. It turns out that the right set of moves, which I've already figured out earlier, is this. U, B2, D, R2, D prime, L2, U prime. Let's take a look at where that's ended up. The two bad corners are here and here. Rather, the four bad corners are here and here. And the two bad edges are sitting pretty right between them. And they're right above an E-slice where the two bad edges are next to each other. This is perfectly set up to the DR trigger. Now, if we do L, then we complete the DR. And this is exactly the thought process behind RZP. The first L took us from something weird and something that was not really clear how to solve to a case that we actually knew how to do. Then we did a couple of moves and ended up solving DR from there. Note that either L or L prime could have worked here in order to get to RZP. What I usually do is I usually pick the non-prime move, and then if I need to do more moves or I need to switch this to an L2, I'll just do an L2, and that way I can do it for no penalty, and I can always cancel it when writing down the final solution. It's just what I find is easier. You can do it whichever way you like. I can actually give you another example using the same scramble, but this time we are using the other axis, which orange top. So if we take a look here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 bad corners and 1, 2, 3 bad edges in the E layer, which means we have 4C, 6E. Again, not necessarily a DRM that we recognize, but it turns out that in one move, we can do U, and this gives us RZP. This time, it's a different one though. 1, 2, 3 bad corners and 2 bad edges. Now, it actually turns out that this is actually pretty easy to set up. All I have to do is do R, D2, R2. And that actually sets up to the trigger exactly. You can take a look here. We have these two that are bad, these two that are bad, and this one that is bad. Which means that all I need to do is do D, R, D prime, and I end up with DR on this axis. So the reason I show you this is that it shows that there are two possible DRs from the exact same EO, and both of them have differing lengths and different continuations, which really cements that you really should be checking for both available axes after EO. I hope I've made that abundantly clear. I've mentioned that I think 3 or 4 times at this point. So don't be like me and just not even realize that there's another entire opportunity to get to DR if you just do a Z rotation. We've now learned how to get to DR in theory. We follow these 3 steps. 1, we generate as many EOs as possible within the time constraints. This is all based off of the information I gave in the last video. Then we evaluate each of them to see if it's already in RZP or if we can get to RZP within a couple moves. Then what we do is we look at all the states that are in RZP and check to see if we can arrange them to the trigger in a small number of moves. And then from there, we just execute the trigger to solve DR. The only thing is, when doing this last step, you'll want to be mindful of the state of the E-slice. And here's an example. Now, it looks like we have the 2 bars here, so we should be entirely set up to do the one move trigger. But it turns out that even though we were in the right DRM, we actually didn't have the state completely set up correctly. This is because the E-slice was not in the state that we expected it to be in. Instead of having the 2 bad edges here and here, kind of being sandwiched between the bars, the bad edges are here. And this doesn't help us any. And in order to fix it, we'd have to do something like R2, U prime D, F2, U D, L. And this does end up giving us DR, which is good in this case, but we actually had to do a lot of moves in order to get there. And it may have just been easier to pay attention to the E layer to begin with. Here's a slightly more realistic example where caring about the E layer actually ends up mattering. Now, this is the same RZP that I did in the first scramble. Instead of doing UB2, you could start by doing DL2. And maybe there's some intuition that you think that this is better. Unfortunately, if we continue with doing this and get to our 2 bars, you notice that the state of the E layer is kind of a disaster. We actually can't do our normal trigger here because, once again, if we try to align them on top of each other, the bars are not sandwiched, or they're not sandwiching rather the 2 bad layers in the 2 bad edges in the E layer. And so we're much better off just paying attention to the E slice as we are building our DR trigger. I actually don't think that even if you did it this way and did a couple extra moves to fix this problem, if you would get a different HTR. But even if that were the case, it's just far too many moves. And at this level, or the level that the video series is aimed at, this is just not worth your time whatsoever. The other thing to mention is when to NIS. For the audience this video is aimed for, I would recommend NISing after RZP, but not after EO. There is a subtle difference, as not all EOs will give you RZP. If you NIS after just EO, you might have to do RZP again, which may or may not be as easy as it was on the other side of the scramble, and it just introduces a lot of extra complexity. It's a lot easier to NIS after RZP if it looks like the DR continuation you're going to get is going to be pretty tricky. Jay's speed solving post has some more points on this, when to NIS and when not to NIS, if you're curious for more information. And the last thing I want to mention in this segment is how to tell if a continuation is going to take a lot of moves. This is unfortunately something that can only really come from practice. There are some techniques that advanced solvers use, such as JZP and ARM statistics, but that's way beyond the scope of this series. I mean, for context, that's stuff that I don't even use, which means that you don't need it if you want to get low 30s. The best way to do it is just do a lot of practice and your brain will eventually figure out the patterns. Notably, DR is a lot harder to get good at compared to EO, and it will take actual practice for your brain in order to get good at recognizing some of these patterns. One way to do that is just doing attempts, but I actually don't think that it's very efficient. I highly recommend starting with just doing hand scrambles and giving it a try. For example, if you want to try working on 4C4E, you can do an R move and then scramble without doing any quarter turns on F, B, R, or L, only allowing yourself U and D quarter turns. This will preserve 4C4E. And just ignore the move count at first. Just focus on getting to DR at all successfully. This will greatly help your recognition, and slowly but surely you'll figure out better and better solutions. The added advantage of doing this is you don't need access to a system to give you scrambles like a computer. So you can do this while you're on a flight or on a bus or just bored in class. That's actually how I got used to doing DR and HTR, just sitting in cramped Spirit flights, flying in between US and Peru during Christmas 2023. Now, a good online resource is the TaoU trainer, which you might have seen before in the context of ZBLL training. There's a mode that actually gives you 4C4E scrambles that are 1 to 6 moves away when you're doing DR, which I actually found really helpful to start building patterns and understanding how efficient solutions work. Since you get the actual scramble itself, you can recreate the state and follow along with the optimal solution, noticing the different patterns it does and how it manipulates some of the pieces. And that can be really useful in your own solutions. And a third option is just to follow what other people do and take a look at reconstructions. I've only recently started looking at reconstructions, and it's actually really enlightening to see what other people do, especially those who are only slightly above my skill level. An incredible resource for this is 333.fm. It's become one of my favorite sites for FMC in the last year, and there are just an absurd number of attempts that people have worked on, and they give decently detailed reconstructions for it. I cannot recommend it enough. It is the online home of FMC in my opinion. It's so good, I will probably make an addendum video going over its features alongside other tools like Nissi and Mallard, maybe once the main series fully wraps up. When you do start doing attempts, either official or unofficial, it's helpful to have a rough move count target for each step. I would suggest the following when you're starting out. Less than 5 moves for EO, 6 or less moves for RZP, and 15 or less moves for DR. This prevents you from wasting way too much time on RZP, which sometimes you can do in 4 moves, sometimes you can do in 3 moves, but this way if you just keep it to 1 or 2 moves, then it will be a lot easier for you to check the various RZPs. Now, one way you could do this is you could naively just go down the list of EOs and check each one to see if there's a short RZP, and then check each RZP for DR. but you risk wasting time on long DRs before even getting the chance to see shorter ones. As such, I recommend the following workflow. Write down all EOs that are less than 5 moves in 10 minutes. Then check the shortest ones for RZP in 1 or 2 additional moves. Now check the shortest RZPs for DRs and skip the ones that you think are very lengthy. Keep going until the 30-minute mark. I call this thing a contour search, since each time you go from one EO to another or one RZP to another, the number of moves never strictly decreases. So you always check the shortest ones available. But you can also think of this as a uniform cost search over states if you're familiar with graph traversals. In any case, using this, you should have a good chance of getting to short DRs. As with EO, you'll want to generate a good number of these DRs because you want to have many starting points for HTR. It's not useful if you get a 9-move DR that has a horrible continuation, let's say. And there's no way to know that until you generate a bunch of these DRs. This is something we'll discuss again in the next video, but just keep that in mind. You want to generate more than one DR, at least eventually. Maybe for now, it's good to just focus on getting one, just so you feel like you have some advancement. But yeah, just keep this in mind. You're going to be pretty bad at doing this at first. Like I said, I think I'm actually still pretty bad at it. It's pretty normal for it to take like a lot of time and a bunch of attempts before you can even get to the point where you can come up with even more than one DR. So don't feel too bad about that. I think that wraps up everything I have to say on DR at this moment. As always, let me know what needs to be clarified in the comments below. I started adding a clarification section in the last video's description, and I plan to continue that for the rest of the DR for Dummies series. Top solvers are welcome to correct any mistakes, and please recommend supplemental resources for both me and everyone else. On a bit of an aside, the more I plan, write, film, and edit this series, the more and more I'm reminded of Bad Mephisto solving tutorials from a decade ago. That series was what got me into competitive cubing in the first place, so I'm hoping that this series can do the same for people who are interested in FMC. So if you're a viewer and you don't understand what's going on, you should definitely ask questions. I think it's very likely that many people are going to be confused on the same topic, and it would be pretty cool to have a little community form and just have this vault of questions that have been answered for anyone who's trying to learn DR or just FMC in the future. And whatever, SAP story out of the way, that rounds it out. Next week, we're going to talk about HTR. That's going to be quite the adventure, and I hope you'll join me for that. For now, Manu, signing off.